it's a particular pleasure actually to be in this room, because this is where I launched a little book called The Bottom Billion, which you know, did quite well. So I hope you know, that's a good precedent. Launching things in this room really takes off. I wanted to really pick up from where Chantal left off. It's of course true that African economic policies improved quite a lot over the last 15 years, and that it's been increasingly built domestically. But there's a huge policy challenge that's arrived, and that is Africa's got the biggest opportunity that it's ever had and ever will have in the massive surge in natural resource prices, which has triggered an even bigger surge of natural resource discoveries in Africa. Africa's the last frontier for search, because there's been so little search in the last 40 years. And that's why every month you read of a new significant discovery in an African country. Now, what we know about the management of natural resources is that it's acutely policy sensitive. Policy matters far more for development based on natural resources than it does for development based on manufactured exports, for example. And you just have to think of that same natural resource diamonds and Botswana and Sierra Leone to make that realization. Botswana, a landlocked desert, Sierra Leone, this beautiful coastal position, both 40 years ago get their diamonds. One becomes the richest country per capita in Africa, and one goes to the bottom of the world's Human Development Index. And it's the landlocked desert that goes up, and the beautiful coastal position that goes down. Why? Because policy choices matter enormously. So the gearing from policy to outcomes is dramatically larger with natural resources than with anything else. And yet that is Africa's opportunity. And if we look back over the last 40 years in Africa, there are more Sierra Leones than there are Botswanas. The default option is to repeat the history of plunder. It's not inevitable that a bad history is repeated. The default option is just that, it's the default option, it's not inevitable. And my favourite example has nothing to do with Africa. It starts with the question, what is the best run economy in Europe today? And the answer is not my own. It's not a very difficult question, it's Germany. Right? And then the interesting question is, why is Germany the best run economy in Europe today? And the interesting answer is because it used to be the worst. 3 generations ago, Germany was the only country in Europe really to mess up. Hyperinflation. Came out of that with a burning sense, never again. Which is where Africa is now. That burning sense of never again to plunder. Germany's problem was different, right? Hyperinflation, not resource extraction. Resource extraction harder, but politically there's the same phenomenon. Africa is now where Germany was in the late 1940s, that sense of never again. Now the German genius was to turn that burning, that inchoate sense of never again into a practical political reality. And in doing that it did 3 things. And generically this is the political tripod for good economic policies that Africa now needs in harnessing its natural resources. And the political tripod Germany built was first, get some economic rules in place. If you want to live down poor economic policy decisions, get some economic rules in place. That's starting to happen in Africa now. Last year, Ghana put in place, legislated a savings rule with 30% of the oil revenues. Right? So you're getting the rules. believe it or not, rules are not enough. We don't have to look to Africa to learn that rules are not enough. Let's stay with Germany. Right? That's this wonderful thing that Britain's not involved in, thank God, the euro. Right? 2 rules, 17 countries, 11 years. How many of these fine, upstanding European countries have obeyed those 2 fiscal rules for 11 years? Well, I guess 1. Right? Not Germany, Finland. Right? It's either very good or a bit silly, really. But anyway, so rules alone are not enough. Right? So you've got to go beyond rules. What else did Germany do? Well, they built dedicated institutions. They designed and built dedicated institutions. If you need to fight inflation, you need a central bank, independent central bank. Africa's problems are different. Africans will need to design purpose-built institutions for the decision chain that you face in handling natural resources, from the prospecting process right through to how you invest the revenues. You need to design your own dedicated institution. But the third political leg of the tripod was the most important thing for Germany. It's not the rules and the institutions. Germany built a critical mass of citizens who understood the issues and therefore have defended the rules and the institutions ever since. So that's the political tripod that Africa has to build. The economic rules, the purpose-designed institutions, and that critical mass of citizens who understand the issues. Now, there's no substitute for doing that with domestic capacity. That process cannot be built externally. One reason is that foreigners are not trusted, right? Unsurprisingly. And so, to build a community of understanding has to be a domestic process. But it's more than that. It's that institutions, you don't just download an institution from the global ether and say we want that here. Institutions have to be context-specific, and they grow organically, reflecting the political economy of their society. And this is, in a completely different context, a mistake that the French make. The French have this critique of the Anglo-Saxon world, as if the Anglo-Saxons are a common entity. And as a Brit, I want to say that British economic institutions are nothing like American institutions. Nothing like. We don't have a president for a start. You might have noticed we've got a queen, right? We've got a parliament, not a congress. Right? So the political institutions are completely different. And the detailed economic institutions, bankruptcy laws, completely different in the two societies. And that's the Anglo-Saxon world. Within the Anglo-Saxon world is a diversity of institutions which work, each institution works in its context. And when we get to Africa, the same is going to be true. And it's not one set of institutions across Africa. Its institutions have to be built society by society so they work within the society. This is not rocket science, building local economic understanding of capacity. Let's take India, right? The last 20 years, India, a long and successful process of economic reform, which came out of a lot of Indian economic capacity. A lot. Both individuals and institutions. Okay? And so it's no surprise that when you get up to the Indian political leadership, there's some very fine economic minds there. And it's not just India. Chile, famously. Why has Chile been so successful in Latin America? Because it built trained economists and then built institutions. Those economists then built local institutions. Now, Africa as Shanta has said, Africa has advanced. So there are now African economists, which, 30 years ago was virtually an oxymoron. You didn't have a cadre of African economists 30 years ago, and now you do. Some of you are here. But there's still a long way to go. Africa is a continent, 54 countries, and the capacity is wholly inadequate for the task at hand. Wholly inadequate. And so there's a huge task of building those capacities. I've been for over 20 years involved in the African Economic Research Consortium, which has it's been part of the process of building that capacity. But it's a long way to go. ARC is sort of built from the bottom. What is now needed is some prestigious top-rank institutions. And you don't build those from junior PhDs upwards. You build them with some people who've already arrived. Right? And that's where I come to Leonard. Leonard has already arrived. He's a professor at Princeton, pretty cool, and he's got a long list of prestigious publications to match it. You don't become a professor of Princeton on promise, you become a professor at Princeton on attainment. Right? And that's what Leonard has done. Leonard also, as well as being a very distinguished economist, has a lot of practical, on-the-ground experience in Africa. He's pioneered a lot of engagement with policymakers, and some of it was fascinating work. Working with policymakers, getting policymakers to do research experiments, not even realizing probably that they were doing research experiments. Amazing. Let me close with an example from Britain of where I think Leonard is where a friend of mine, John Kay, was about 35 years ago. John Kay, famous economist, sometimes he has a weekly column in the Financial Times. Many of the time, he's a very good, distinguished guy. But when he was a young man, first he was an academic. He was appointed at a ludicrously young age to tenure in Oxford in the Department of Economics. Then he quit, and he went to London. He was very concerned. His speciality was fiscal policy. He was a tax economist, and he was very worried that British fiscal policy was such a mess, and the debate was such a mess. And so he created a little institute, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies today is the most authoritative institute in the country on economic policy, and it's been massively influential in fiscal policy. It has inspired the independent budget for the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, and whenever the government does anything fiscally, the first port of call for journalists is the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And that's taken time, but that's my goal for you, Leonard. Become the equivalent of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. My final remark is that in building that critical mass of informed citizens, we need an engagement between academic economists and the media. It's a vital matter. And there's actually a new Gates program that I'm involved in trying to do that. But it really needs purpose-designed academic institutions in Africa that see that as an appropriate role for themselves. And I think Leonard will see that as an appropriate role. So, good luck, Leonard, you need it.
Thanks very much, Paul.